My name is Robert Vaughn, a.k.a. as Napoleon Solo, for this interview only. No, as a matter of fact, it became quite clear to me fairly early on in the 60s, unless you were on television. As a matter of fact, Robert Vaughn, a friend of mine, said if it didn't happen on television, it didn't happen. If you don't see it on television, it didn't happen. As television expanded and became obviously more important in an actor's life, I thought, well, now that I've got a couple of good movies under my belt and the door is not being knocked upon to do any more good movies, I had a chance to do a series called The Lieutenant, produced by Norman Felton and Arena Productions, starring Gary Lockwood, who went on to great success in Space Odyssey. And it was the story of the Marine Corps, and I was playing the commanding officer. It was a co-starring role. And as a result of that, I became in contact with Norman Felton, and Norman ultimately selected to play the Man from U.N.C.L.E. I'd tell you, yes, there was a flashpoint, and it was the spring of the first year. I would say it would be March of 1965. Yeah, because it went back. No, yeah. Wait a minute. We went on in 64. Yes, it would be the spring of 65, toward the end of the first year. And I'd come east from California to do publicity for the show. And I had heard, but I hadn't yet witnessed, there were an awful lot of teenagers in love with the show and in love with David and in love with me. David had proved this to be the case because he'd gone out and appeared in public and gotten swamped. Anyway, I was with some friends of mine that David called the Irish Mafia that hung around. We all hung around together. And we went to see The Royal Hunt of the Sun with Chris Plummer at the Anta Theater. And this was, probably was in February because it was still cold outside and there was snow on the ground. And I came into the theater with my friends, and I heard more bump, bump, bump. And then it became louder and louder, and I looked around assuming there was someone there that I should see. And I turned around, and the people that were applauding were pointing at me. And that was the first realization that it was, because I've been going to Broadway theater since I was 10 years old, and I never heard anybody being applauded walking into a theater. I mean, I was never there when the president was there, but it never happened before, and I was absolutely stunned, and I actually got very red and embarrassed and slunk down in my seat, and that was the first time that I knew. The second time was shortly after that, when I arrived in London, and it was a Sunday night, about 2 a.m., and the place was filled with thousands of schoolgirls, teenage girls who should have been in school and were in school the next day, waiting there for me. And the people that are really fans of the show, who followed it from day one, always referred to the first season, which was done in black and white, as the best season of the show. I think it may have been the best season in terms of the stories, because they were strictly action, adventure, humor, not comedy, humor. It began to blend into comedy in the second season, but there were enough of shows in color in the second season. I think that's where it really took off, even though Sam Rolfe, the creator of the show, who supervised the first year, was not with it. I think it really looked, to me, in 40 years ago, I think that was the best season of the show. Well, the best part of being an acting rock star was being in The Man from U.N.C.L.E. as the Man from U.N.C.L.E., which was made a tremendous difference in my life. Up to that time, although I had done a couple of A pictures, Magnificent Seven, which became a big success over the years. It wasn't nearly as a big success when it first came out. It was considered a very classy Western, and that was about it. And I got an Academy Award nomination for my first A picture with Paul Newman, and that's about as far as I expected to go at that particular point in time. I was still what would be called a business acting actor. In other words, I became, as a result of U.N.C.L.E., a negotiating actor, and that made the difference. It makes a difference in every actor's life. When I say negotiating, I could ask for more. When somebody would offer me some money, I wouldn't just say it as I did before U.N.C.L.E., thanks. I'd say through my agent, I want more than this. I want more per diem. I want 4 first-class tickets. I want a better trailer. I want a better hotel. All those things became negotiable in my life, which had never happened before. I took what I was given. That was the big difference that U.N.C.L.E. made for me, and that's never changed. The worst part was not being able to go anywhere. I realized about the middle of the second year that I had to get a secretary to do everything for me, to do all my shopping, to appear in public, because I couldn't go to a Macy's or an Alexander's in New York or whatever the comparable stores were in L.A. at the time in Beverly Hills, without attracting a crowd, which slowed down the business of the store and didn't allow me to get my shopping done. So shopping ended for me for about 18 months to 2 years during that. That was the biggest change, is really having your life invaded by other people. I loved it on the one hand, but it was difficult on the other hand. And on balance, I much prefer to have gone through it and had the experience than not. Sam, I got to know obviously only after I did the show. Sam would appear on the set from time to time, but very rarely. Norman would appear very rarely. They would just kind of stand back in the shadows and smile. This is the first year, and watch what was going on. Sam I had known from Have Gun Will Travel, and he was a well-respected producer, creator of shows, producer, and most importantly, writer. And he supervised and wrote all of the scripts for the first year, or contributed, I should say, to all of the scripts for the first year. But I didn't have a great deal of contact with him. However, my girlfriend at the time, named Joyce Jameson, had gone to UCLA with Sam, and they were in the same class. So subsequently, I started to socialize with him through that connection, not through the show particularly. Of course, we talked about the show, but I didn't have a great deal of contact with either he or Norman during the show, other than to see them on the set from time to time back in the shadows. Of course, everybody tried to do the crew tried to work a little faster when Norman was standing back there, and the actors tried to act better and so on. And I might mention that I asked Norman after the show was a success why he had selected me out of all of the obvious people my age and weight and height and talent. And he said, well, one of the reasons, he said, I thought we wanted to make sure that the heroes of this show were normal-looking people, not 6'2" and 6'7" and whatever Jim Arness was. We had a lot of giants doing leads and shows. And I said, but for me, he said, when you were doing the lieutenant, after they would say cut, you'd usually say something very wry and very humorous and make the crew laugh. He said, so I knew you had a sense of humor about yourself, and therefore you can use that in the character of Napoleon Solo. And that's, I guess, one of the reasons that contributed to my becoming a rock star / actor, or other way around. Well, I knew Leo, of course, from motion pictures and from television as Topper, and I think I mentioned in Heitland's book, I said that he was the real class of the show. We were the other two young guys in their early 30s were pretending to be classy. He was the class of the show. He actually was younger than I am right now when he started the show, and he was very, very worried that he wouldn't be able to do the job because he was going to forget lines and so on. But he never did. I don't know whether he practiced them at home with his wife or not. But he had an absolutely sensational sense of humor. And I can't tell you all the things he said, but I'll tell you a couple of funny things. I think it was after the first season we came back to start the second season. And I said, Leo, did you have a good vacation? He said, yes. I said, well, lovely vacation. He said, well, no, not actually. I didn't have a lovely vacation. I said, why is that? And he said, well, I've been watching my wife fall apart and watching myself fall apart. And basically, that's what we did during the vacation. We watched each other fall apart. And he spoke that slowly, too. Another time, I believe he had an operation near the beginning of the first year of the show when he actually was cast in the role, and we can go back over that a little later. And it required him to wear something on his person. I don't know whether it was a colostomy bag or something like that. And we were on location one day, and he got up and he was starting to walk somewhere. And David said, "Where are you going, Leo?" And he said, "I'm going down to the men's room." He said, "Oh, David said, that's half a mile away. Let me get your car." They said, No. So he kept walking, and I said, "Get him a car or something." So the car started to go over there, and he turned around, and he said, No car. I'll be done by the time I get there." And that's the kind of wonderful dry humor he had. He was an enormous asset to the show. Well, there are no Nielsen machines, or there were then in dormitories and fraternities at that time. But when the kids from college, men and women, came back and took over the control of the one black and white television set that was in most American homes at that time, suddenly we began to appear going higher and higher in the Nielsen ratings until, and then that coupled with Chuck Painter, who I mentioned earlier, his idea, we literally went to, I don't know, 13 cities, or maybe even more than that, on weekends. We'd fly out of L.A. on Friday night when we finished the show, hit 2 or 3 cities, meet in New York on Sunday evening. When I say we, I mean Chuck Painter, David McCallum, and myself. And then we'd fly back in, and usually about 2 o'clock in the morning, and start shooting the following morning at 8 o'clock. We did that for, I think, a month or two, and every city that we hit was a Nielsen city, and you had immediate reaction the following week. The show was ascending in the ratings up to #1, which it became briefly in the fall of '65. So the combination of, and the most important, I will mention, is David McCallum became a national and subsequently international teenage idol. My fan base was the elder women, 21 to 35, around like that. David had the preteens and teens, and we covered the market pretty much with the two of us. Well, one thing I might mention, very often, not recently, but around that time, people would say, you've been to Rome, and because I've been on the show, And the reason that everybody believed that is this: they had standing sets, exterior sets on Lot 2 and Lot 3 that had the main street of Rome, of London, of Paris, western streets, all kinds of streets, exterior, in some cases interiors also. And then on Lot 3, they had a whole forest with the showboat from Showboat, the trees that Tarzan. In other words, you could go anywhere in the world within 15 minutes from the studio gate. Then those are all knocked down. They're now apartment buildings or oil wells, one of the two. That was how the show was designed, around those sets that were always there. I think when we started getting these silly scripts, which was middle to the end of the second year, I was trying to adapt these qualities I mentioned earlier that I thought I had, which would be attractive, to the funniness of the script. I think in some cases I went too far. I probably had too much fun dancing with the guy in the gorilla suit because I was laughing. I've surrounded myself intentionally, including my current wife and only wife, by people that make me laugh. I love to laugh. I will go anywhere to get a good laugh. Yeah, I remember. The only thing I remember, we shot it up at. I think we shot it at the Griffith Observatory, if I remember correctly. And yes, I did have to fight myself. I don't remember. I think that day I did have a little hangover, as I recall, because I remember we had to keep doing it over and over and over again. And I got tired after quite a bit of time. There are fans in England, particularly because the show, although very successful in America, was even more successful from day one. As a matter of fact, I came across some material that Lee Pfeiffer had sent me, where there was a 5-day running box office where one of the Uncle movies had done the biggest 5-day box office at the Ritz Theater in Leicester Square, bar none, any other, including all other movies that had played there. So it was enormously successful, first as a movie, then as a television show. And these fans today, who are 50, 60 years of age and a little younger, know lines from shows. They know the names of the shows. They know dialogue, specific dialogue and specific scenes. They know what year the show appeared, what kind of a car. They know these phenomenal things far more than I ever knew when I was doing it. I never thought about any things that didn't happen because that didn't enter into my thinking to the extent that I thought at all about the character of Napoleon Solo, who was just Robert Vaughn with another name, who wasn't frightened of violence. The one where a well-known Russian actor played Santa Claus, is it called The Bells Are Ringing Affair or something like that? And I think we shot it around Christmas time, and it just seemed like a very charming, lovely script, and I loved the actor who was playing Santa Claus, whose name escapes me for the moment, a very well-known Russian actor. But that's the only one that stands out as being something that I remember clearly. For some reason, I remember the show I did with Jack Palance, but it's not because I was so good in it. I remember I looked better than I ever looked in my life, and why I could never figure out. I didn't have any different makeup. I didn't have a different, maybe it was different lighting or something. But I just remember, and I said, boy, I'd like to keep that look as long as I can while I'm still acting in front of cameras. I was very impressed by Jack Palance. I actually did Hamlet with his wife, Virginia, at the Pasadena Playhouse, so I got to know him on that level because he was sitting out in the audience during rehearsals. It was a very strange feeling to have Jack Palance, who's a menacing-looking guy, sitting out in the darkness watching his wife with me acting in Hamlet. It was an odd sensation. It changed me from being a working actor to being a negotiating actor, as you alluded to. In other words, I instead of just being willing to take the jobs that were offered at the price that they were offered, where they were offered, I went, as a result of U.N.C.L.E. and Bullet, which came right after U.N.C.L.E., to be able to negotiate better salaries, better working conditions, better per diem, better first-class airfares, better hotels, better everything. And now I owe all of it to the man from U.N.C.L.E. Well, I don't think I've shaken it off yet, but the very fact that I went back to playing Black Hats in Bullet right after U.N.C.L.E. kind of balanced it in favor of my being able to play what I was doing before U.N.C.L.E., which was essentially guest starring roles on television shows as the bad guy, the anti-hero. Oh, it was the best years of my life, no question. I mean, unmarried, I qualify that. I've had a whole different life since then.